The first cases of AIDS in the United States were reported in 1981. By 1983, there were over 1,000 reported cases in the US, and by that point, already half had proven fatal. Unlike other high mortality rate viruses like Ebola, HIV tended not to be something one may eventually recover from once infected. Part of the slowed government response was because of the epidemic curve of the HIV virus. Unlike Ebola virus, it was gradual, with symptoms appearing in a matter of years instead of days. It's easier for epidemiologists to encourage behavior changes in a population for an in-your-face disease like smallpox or Ebola virus, but AIDS, despite its near 100% mortality rate, was so slow-moving that not only was mass behavior change difficult to encourage, most people who spread the virus did not themselves even know that they were infected. Drug use was a risk factor, unprotected sex was also a risk factor, but many risk factors were not in people's control. For instance, the 1980s was not a great time to be a hemophiliac. But another aspect was the factor that the epicenter of the outbreak was not in middle-class straight white families, but the gay community in urban centers like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York City. Since all of the earliest cases were discovered in gay men, it was easy for lawmakers to moralize the outbreak, not just as a sexually transmitted disease, but also of moral degeneracy. Pat Buchanan, who was the leader of White House communications at the time, wrote about AIDS, "The poor homosexuals. They have declared war on nature, and now nature is exacting an awful retribution." Reagan didn't seem to understand the seriousness of the epidemic until his friend Rock Hudson announced that he was HIV positive 4 years into the epidemic, but even then it wasn't enough to get the administration to act on it. Dr. Donald P. Francis, an epidemiologist within the CDC assigned to the AIDS outbreak, later wrote, "Doctors confronting a new epidemic caused by a highly fatal infectious agent are much like firefighters confronting a fire. Early aggressive action pays off, whereas slow passive action leads to massive destruction." The CDC, with the help of Francis, developed a comprehensive plan in 1985 to help stop the spread of HIV, which had by now infected thousands, but the Reagan administration rejected it outright. The administration told epidemiologists within the CDC to look pretty and do as little as possible. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop was explicitly banned by the Reagan administration from addressing the AIDS crisis. When in 1986 he broke with orders and did address what was by now a pandemic, he was attacked from within all areas of the administration. The powers that be within the CDC refused to stand up to their bosses higher up in the Reagan administration. Director of the CDC, James Mason, regarding the CDC's failure to act, later said, "There are certain areas which, when the goals of science collide with moral and ethical judgment, science has to take a time out." By the late 1980s, with now hundreds of thousands of new cases of HIV, it wasn't an issue of passivity, but of active obstruction. An increasingly popular narrative surrounding the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s was that there was nothing to be done to stop it, that the onus was solely on the infected, and there was nothing but their own behavior to blame. But the spread of HIV/AIDS in the United States was not inevitable, and had the powers that be acted sooner, millions of lives could have been saved. This is what happens when governments fail the people they are sworn to protect.